3 fighter jets worth hundreds of millions slicing through the morning sky. Their pilots? Confident. Their mission? To test if promises made on paper actually mean anything in the real world. What they didn't know was that they were already being watched, tracked, hunted by technology. So advanced. It was like bringing a knife to a laser fight. This is the story of September 19th, the day when old-school tactics met cutting-edge warfare, when pride collided with reality at 30,000 feet, and when pilots who thought they were invisible discovered they were actually glowing like Christmas trees on someone else's screens. Stay with me, because what happens next will change how you think about modern air combat forever. September 19th started like any other morning in Estonia. Coffee brewing, people heading to work, air traffic controllers monitoring their screens, watching the usual parade of civilian aircraft crossing the Baltic region. But at exactly 9 in the morning, those screens told a different story. 3 Russian MiG-31 interceptors banking southward. No communication. No transponder signals. Just 3 metal birds cutting through Estonian airspace near Vaindloo Island like they own the place. Now, here's what makes the MiG-31 special. NATO calls it the Foxhound, and it's not your average fighter jet. This thing was designed during the Cold Era specifically to hunt American bombers. It can theoretically hit speeds close to 3 times the speed of sound. Its radar system was built to spot massive aircraft from hundreds of kilometers away. The pilots flying these machines that morning probably felt pretty confident. After all, they were sitting in proven platforms with decades of operational history. They penetrated about 10 kilometers into Estonian territory, cruising at 30,000 feet where their radar systems work best. Below them? Tallinn. 400,000 civilians starting their Friday, completely unaware that 3 aircraft were circling overhead, essentially asking a question. Are you really going to do something about this? The Russian pilots started their circular pattern, probably expecting Estonian fighters to scramble. Maybe they wanted footage for propaganda purposes. Maybe they wanted to test response times. Maybe they just wanted to send a message. What they absolutely did not expect was that they'd been tracked since the moment their wheels left the runway back at their base. Estonian radar operators had been watching them from takeoff, tracking their flight path, calculating their trajectory, and they definitely didn't expect what was already in the air, waiting for them, while the Russian pilots were circling, feeling untouchable. 2 Italian F-35 Lightning II fighters were already airborne. Part of the standing NATO air policing mission in Estonia, these weren't scrambled in response to the intrusion. They were already up there, already hunting. Now, let me explain something about the F-35 that sounds like science fiction but is absolutely real. These Italian pilots never turned on their radar. Not because they couldn't find the MiGs, but because they didn't need to. The F-35 has something called a distributed aperture system. 6 infrared cameras positioned around the aircraft, creating a complete 360-degree view of everything around it. These cameras can detect heat signatures from incredible distances, and the MiG-31's twin engines, they burn hot. Really hot. Around 1200 degrees Celsius hot. Through their advanced helmets, which cost about $400,000 each, the Italian pilots could literally see through their own aircraft. They could look down through the floor of their cockpit and see the heat signatures of the Russian jets above them, glowing against the cold atmosphere. The F-35's radar cross-section is about the size of a golf ball on enemy radar. The MiG's radar system was designed to find bombers the size of buildings. Trying to spot an F-35 with that technology is like trying to find a specific pebble on a beach while wearing sunglasses at night. The Russians had no idea they were being stalked by invisible predators. But it gets better. Because this wasn't just 2 Italian jets playing cat and mouse. The entire NATO integrated air defense network was already coordinating a response. Finnish F-18 Hornets pushed in from the east. Here's the clever part. They stayed visible on Russian radar deliberately. They wanted to be seen. Why? To herd the MiGs westward, away from their escape routes, Swedish Gripen fighters waited silently over the Baltic. Radars completely off. Not because they were hiding, but because they were getting position updates through something called Link 16 Data Link. This system shares information between allied aircraft at incredible speeds. creating one unified picture of the battlefield that everyone can see simultaneously. Estonian controllers were vectoring everyone into position without saying a word over radio. It was digital coordination versus 3 Russians, using encrypted voice commands like they were still flying in the 1980s. The technological gap wasn't measured in years. It was measured in generations. The Italian F-35s began their climb, passing through 25,000 feet using what's called a cold intercept. No radar emissions. Just passive sensors quietly gathering information. Their electronic warfare system was tracking the MiGs by their own radar emissions. Every time that Russian radar swept past searching for threats, it was actually telling the F-35s exactly where they were, what mode they were in, even which direction they were looking. It's like someone trying to find you in the dark with a flashlight, not realizing that every time they turn it on, they're telling you exactly where they are. The MiG pilots kept checking their 6 o'clock position. That over-the-shoulder glance fighter pilots have been doing since the first dogfights over Europe more than a century ago. But the threats weren't behind them. They were everywhere and nowhere. At 9:12 a.m., the lead Italian pilot made contact on the international emergency frequency. Russian aircraft, you are in NATO airspace. Turn east immediately. The Russian pilot's response? We are currently on a scheduled flight. He heard. He understood. He acknowledged. But he kept flying. In Russian military culture, following NATO instructions would mean admitting they violated the airspace. So they kept circling, pretending they were in control, while their threat warning systems started screaming. Those receivers could tell something was out there. But not what. Not where. Just random electronic noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Simultaneously. The Italian pilots settled into the MiGs' blind spots, directly above where the mechanical radar couldn't see without the Russians rolling their entire aircraft over. 2 F-35s tracking 3 MiGs who didn't even know they were being hunted. Then the Russian pilots tried to get smart. The lead MiG suddenly dove toward low altitude, attempting to hide in what's called surface clutter. Down there, radar returns bounce off waves and terrain, creating confusion for targeting computers. Classic move. Textbook stuff. Probably worked great in the 1990s. The Italian F-35 pilot didn't even change altitude. His radar uses Doppler processing that can separate a 500-knot fighter from 20-knot seagulls by velocity alone. The MiG was burning precious fuel in a useless descent while the F-35's computer adjusted the firing solution in real time, tracking him like a patient predator. Realizing the dive wasn't working, the Russian pulled up hard. Twin engines and full afterburner, climbing for 40,000 feet where the MiG-31 was designed to dominate. At that altitude, thinner air means less drag. The Foxhound can theoretically hit incredible speeds up there, fast enough to outrun most fighters. Except, speed doesn't help when your hunter is invisible, and your engines are screaming your position to every infrared sensor within 200 kilometers. The F-35's camera system watched the MiGs climb, their engines glowing even brighter against the cold stratosphere, like neon signs advertising their exact location. Inside the MiG cockpits, confusion was turning to concern. Their threat receivers were having electronic seizures. Random chirps and warnings that made no sense. The Italian F-35s were using their electronic warfare suite to inject false targets into the Russian radar. One moment showing 12 contacts. Then 4. Then none. Then 20. This system records incoming radar pulses and transmits them back with slight delays and frequency shifts. To the Russian radar, it looks like multiple aircraft at different ranges and speeds. Ghost copies that appear completely real. The MiGs were fighting shadows while the real threats remained invisible. That's when the Swedish Gripens announced themselves. They'd been lurking 80 kilometers away, radars cold, getting targeting data from the F-35s through that Link 16 system. When they suddenly lit up their pulse Doppler radars at maximum power, the MiG threat receivers went from confused chirping to full panic mode. 2 new contacts, closing fast from the south. The Russians thought they were dealing with 2 invisible Italians. Now Swedes were boxing them in. Finns were still pushing from the east. And those Italian F-35s, were somewhere, but everywhere. The tactical situation had become what NATO calls a honey trap. Visible threats forcing you toward invisible ones. Sweden had joined NATO recently. And here they were, executing complex coordination, like they'd been practicing together for decades. The Swedish pilots could see everything the Italians saw. Target speed, altitude, heading, even estimated fuel state calculated by flight time and maneuvering. When one pilot saw something, they all saw it. Instantly. Automatically. The Russians were still using voice commands, playing telephone at 30,000 feet, while NATO operated like a single organism with multiple sets of eyes. The lead MiG tried to break west toward the Baltic, probably hoping to reach international airspace. The F-35s cut him off without ever appearing on radar. One Italian pilot illuminated him with targeting radar for exactly 1 second, just enough to make his threat receiver scream, then going dark. Before the Russian could react, the other F-35 did the same from a completely different angle. Left, right, above, below. The warnings came from everywhere. The MiG started defensive turns, yanking and banking, their pilots' hearts probably racing. The second MiG pilot decided to try electronic warfare, activating his jamming pod. Against an F-35 radar that changes frequencies 1,000 times per second across multiple bands. It was like trying to stop a flood with a paper towel. The Italian pilots probably didn't even notice. Their systems automatically switched frequencies faster than human thought, maintaining lock while the Russian jammers screamed uselessly into the void. The entire NATO air defense network was now fully active. Polish F-16s were already airborne. German Typhoons were launching. Danish fighters were spinning up. Norwegian pilots were running to their aircraft. The MiG pilots had no idea they'd triggered a response from Stockholm to Rome, everyone eager to demonstrate why the Baltic was NATO territory. The lead MiG pilot made one final aggressive move. He turned toward Tallinn like he was going to overfly the capital. The moment his nose pointed at Estonia's largest city, alarms went off across NATO command centers. An armed Russian fighter heading toward 400,000 civilians changed this. From provocation to potential crisis. The F-35s moved to intercept, but not by blocking their path directly. Instead, the Italian pilots started what's called herding, using the MiG's own fear against them. One F-35 would spike them with radar from the left, forcing them to break right. The moment they turned, the other F-35 would spike from below, forcing them to climb. Each defensive reaction pushed them further from Tallinn and closer to the engagement box that Polish and German fighters were forming to the west. The Russians were being moved like chess pieces by opponents they couldn't see. And their fuel situation was becoming critical. They'd been yanking and banking for 15 minutes, each defensive turn burning fuel they couldn't spare. They had maybe 18 minutes before their jets transformed from aircraft to very expensive submarines. The smart move would be requesting vectors to the nearest airfield, but that would mean admitting defeat, asking NATO for help after violating their airspace. In Russian military culture, there are few things worse. So they kept maneuvering, kept burning fuel, kept pretending they were in control while their options evaporated like jet fuel in AM. Afterburner. Then the Polish F-16s arrived from the west, and they came in aggressive. Their radars locked onto the MiGs immediately. Not subtle, not polite, just pure electromagnetic hostility. This wasn't just an intercept. For the Polish pilots, this was history delivered at 30,000 feet. German Typhoons swept in from the south. These weren't stealth fighters, but they didn't need to be. The Typhoon was built for one purpose: air superiority through overwhelming performance, twin engines producing massive thrust, supercruise capability without afterburner, and a radar that could track incredibly small objects at enormous distances. The Germans took position above the MiGs, the ultimate high ground in air combat. The MiGs were now surrounded by 10 NATO fighters from 5 nations. Italian F-35s they couldn't see, Swedish Gripens from the south, Polish F-16s from the west, German Typhoons from above, Finnish F-18s still pushing from the east. Every escape route led into someone's engagement envelope. Meanwhile, Danish fighters reported airborne. Norwegians were preparing. Even Dutch controllers were asking if they needed to launch. NATO was responding like someone had kicked an anthill. Fighters launching from every base within 500 miles. All converging on 3 Russian jets rapidly running out of fuel options, and Dignity. The lead F-35 pilot decided to end this. He switched his radar from search mode to single target track, painting the lead MiG with focused electromagnetic energy. Inside the Russian cockpit, the threat warning system went from concerned chirping to the continuous tone that gives fighter pilots nightmares. It's the sound that means an advanced radar has locked you up, calculated your exact position, velocity, and acceleration, and is feeding that data to missiles. The Italian held the lock for exactly 5 seconds. Long enough for the Russian pilot to contemplate every decision that led to this moment. Not long enough to legally justify pulling the trigger. Through his helmet display, the F-35 pilot could see the firing solution updating dozens of times per second. A calculated flight path showing where the missile would go. Impact point marked where the MiG's cockpit currently existed. Probability of hit: 97%. The remaining 3% was essentially a rounding error. Modern missiles don't get confused by countermeasures. They analyze each decoy, determine it's not an 81,000-pound aircraft, and continue hunting. They're like tracking dogs that fly at incredible speeds and explode on contact. The Russian pilot's hands were probably shaking as he processed his options. His threat receiver was showing multiple lock indications now. Not just the F-35, Polish F-16s and German Typhoons had joined the party. Every direction showed threats. Every frequency showed jamming. Every option led to destruction. Finally, mercifully, the lead MiG pilot broke radio silence on the emergency frequency, returning to base. The other 2 MiGs immediately banked west toward Kaliningrad, but NATO wasn't done teaching lessons. As the MiGs turned homeward, Swedish Gripens took escort position 500 meters off their right wing, close enough to count rivets, far enough to avoid collision if the Russians tried anything foolish. The Swedish targeting pods started recording in high definition, capturing every detail. Weapons loadout, electronic warfare pods, even tail numbers that would tell intelligence analysts which units were being used for these provocations. At the Polish border, F-16s took over escort duty with noticeable enthusiasm. The Polish pilots maintained missile lock continuously. Not enough to justify engagement. Just enough to keep that warning tone singing in Russian headsets for the entire 400-mile flight home. Link 16 made the handoff between nations seamless. Swedish computers talked to Polish computers, sharing everything from target position to estimated fuel state. German Typhoons took high cover, ready to respond if anything went wrong. Danish F-16s established a barrier to the north. It was international cooperation at its finest. Everyone working together to make a point. The MiG fuel situation was now desperate. The lead aircraft showed enough fuel for maybe 30 minutes at their current consumption. If they had to deviate for weather or traffic, they'd be swimming. The Russian pilots reduced speed to maximum range cruise. 420 knots. Engines barely above idle. Flying like airliners instead of interceptors. The Polish F-16s had to keep hitting their speed brakes to stay in formation. As they approached Kaliningrad, Russian Su-27s scrambled to meet them, probably expecting to escort heroes from a successful mission. Instead, they found 3 MiG-31s being shepherded by half of NATO like students being walked to the principal's office. The Su-27 pilots probably had questions. Why were Polish F-16s so close? Why were the MiGs flying so slowly? Why did their pilots look like they'd aged 10 years? The answers would come later in debriefs that nobody wanted to give. The Italian F-35 pilots watched the MiGs disappear into Kaliningrad airspace, then turned west toward home. They'd been airborne for 2 hours, had plenty of fuel remaining, and hadn't even turned on their radars until the very end. The technological superiority was so complete it was almost unfair. Conclusion 21 o'clock to 22:30. So what did we just witness? This wasn't just an intercept. It was a demonstration of how modern warfare has evolved. How stealth technology, network coordination, and electronic warfare have changed everything we thought we knew about air combat. 3 Russian pilots flew jets designed in the 1970s, using tactics from the Cold Era. against a coordinated alliance operating technology that would seem like magic to pilots from just 20 years ago. They violated airspace expecting a predictable response. Maybe a scramble. Maybe a radio call. Maybe some diplomatic complaints? What they got instead was a masterclass in modern air power. Invisible hunters tracking them from the moment they took off. Multiple nations coordinating seamlessly through data links. Electronic warfare so advanced it created ghost armies in their radar screens. And an escort home that lasted 400 miles, ensuring they understood exactly how outmatched they were. The Baltic remains NATO territory. And Russia just learned they can't even visit without permission, supervision, and escort home. The question is, did they learn the lesson? Or will we be watching another encounter like this soon? If you found this breakdown fascinating, hit that subscribe button.